I now request Dr. Nagaraj Paturi Garu. Uh, he is the leading light, guiding light for us in all the Indica conferences. And there is so much that I personally have benefited from his discussions. He's among our greatest authorities on Sanskrit literature and Shastras, and the engagement of the classical and the folk is something that always fascinates me when I discuss with Dr. Nagraj. And he needs no introduction. Everybody knows Dr. Nagraj. I now request Dr. Nagraj to come and uh, speak about the scope of various themes that we propose to explore as part of this conference, and how we put together this, and how the next 2 days, how he sees in this conference. Dr. Nagaraj Garu.
Thank you, Shivakumar Garu. Shivakumar ji is the chief curator of this conference. I should say the sole curator also. He has been working hard, toiling day and night to curate this conference. He is the one who has gone through all the presentations, all the papers in very great detail, and has been putting together the conference with such a dedication. Yes, I am also a learner along with Shivakumar ji and Deepa ji. Deepa ji is our chief, what to say, the storytelling heroine of this whole conference, because she is from the entire community of storytellers, the theme of this conference. And if she says she's a learner, I should also say yes, I'm also a learner. She and Shivakumar ji, as he said, I'm also a learner, and my learning in this, in putting together this conference, has been mainly the fact that there is such a huge community of storytellers. I never knew this. I, as a child, was a storyteller basically. I was a storyteller because I was not capable of other sports and games. I was not able to play the other uh, muscle power needing games that the other children were playing. So the only way I was able to engage my peers in my childhood was through storytelling. I was called by the street as a hen with chicks all around. I used to go, there were audience all around, all the other children. I used to be a storyteller. But gradually now, through my career, I turned from a performer to a theorist. This is this combination of a creative artist and an analyst in the same person is very much possible. There are many who continue to be creative performers, creative artists, and at the same time they analyze their own art. But in my case, what happened is my bias has been more towards analysis because of university career, teaching and researching career in a university department. And because of this, I today wanted to share with you the scope of the whole theoretical work that is happening around story and storytelling. My distinction between these two, story and storytelling, is deliberate for a theoretical purpose. We have two different words, narrative and narration. Storytelling is all about narration, narrating how you do it. But what you are narrating is a narrative, it's a story. And all over the world, there have been international associations of narrative research. For example, there is an International Folk Narrative Research Association located in Finland, Turku, and Helsinki in Finland. And there have been specialized departments of universities focusing on narrative research. For the benefit of those who are probably not aware, let me share with you that way back, a tale type index was prepared. When people talk about any story anywhere in the world today, they immediately in analysis, they go to the tail type number in that tail type index. It is called Arne Thompson Index. Arne is a Finnish scholar. Thompson is a British scholar. They together put together this book. If one looks at the amount of examples for each tail type that are quoted there from different parts of the world, a reader gets overwhelmed by that. That shows how much globally in folk narratives you have commonality, you have similarity of these stories. In cultural anthropology, whenever a similarity is encountered, there are two ways of looking at it. One is the theory of diffusion. People resort to the theory of diffusion and they say that the cultural item, here in this case, story, has traveled from one place to the other. That is why there are similarities in these stories. And there is another competing theory within cultural anthropology for accounting for similarities. It is called unity of mind theory. It argues that the similarities are because of coincidence, because of a common thinking, because of a universal human thinking, that we have those similarities. Which is true, which is right among these two? Anywhere, in any theoretical position taking, whenever extreme positions are taken, always truth is in the middle ground. Both are true. Diffusion has happened from all parts of the world to all parts of the world. That's very interesting. If you see how diffusion has taken place from, in case of stories, how stories have traveled from one part of the world to the other parts of the world, to imagine how physically this could have happened. Did people travel from one place to the other, or how else could it have happened that a story can travel so far, thousands of miles from one part of the world to the other? Is amazing. That kind of universal comparison of stories and making them into types has happened in tail type index. And there is another book called Motif Index. It takes motifs from these tales and mentions which motif, which story element is found common in various stories. So Motif Index actually connects motifs to tale types, and it's a collective work. And all such analysis, in the case of one Vladimir Prop of Russia, has led to a theory called Morphology of Folktale, in which he proposes that all tales in the world, all stories in the world have the following incident or event functions. And the 31 functions that he lists, he says that all stories need not have all these 31 functions, but some of them definitely are going to be there. And the order of these narratives need of these functions need not be exactly the same also. But mostly he lists them in the order in which they occur in most of the stories. And later, this story progression, how story progresses, there have been wonderful theories. There was the International Conference of Folk Narratives in 94 in Mysore, and wonderful papers were presented about the progression of the story there. What is interesting from an indigenous Indic point of view is that, like many of these soft fields of knowledge, the ancient Indians excelled in the field of narrative analysis also. This is one of the biggest areas where ancient Indians excelled. Once in an Indological email group, one Indian NRI living in Canada, he posted a question. Is there a theory of narrative analysis in ancient India in Sanskrit literature? Most of the responses were no, no such analysis. I was surprised that these scholars who studied Sanskrit, who studied ancient Indian texts, were not able to identify that the Pancha Sandhi theory was narrative analysis theory. Pancha Sandhi, the word is very popular among students of Sanskrit literature and Alankara Shastra, Sahitya, and all that. When I mentioned this, immediate response was Pancha Sandhi is a theory for drama, for Nataka, for Natya, Rupaka, for theater. This word Pancha, five, is found in Aristotle's theory of story progression analysis also. It has got 5 stages. And these 5 stages of Aristotle, the way they are worded in English all over the world today, are exposition, development, climax, denouement, and conclusion. This is presented in a graphical form, exposition to development, then you have the climax, and now you come down towards denouement, unraveling of the story, and unwinding of the story, and then conclusion. As everyone is aware, his theory was also for drama, for theater. But all over the film studies courses today, all over the world, all over storytelling related courses all over the world, people use the same 5-stage analysis of story to teach the students about the progression of story. They don't hesitate to use it for any form of storytelling other than dramatic. But why, in the case of Indian story analysis, the Pancha Sandhi theory is getting limited only to Rupaka is intriguing. In fact, for many aspects of the Panchasandhi analysis of Indian story analysis, narrative analysis, examples are given from Ramayana. It's not Rupaka, it's a Shravya Kavya. Examples are given from that. So there is a lot that is not highlighted the way it needs to be highlighted from the narrative analysis stuff that is available in ancient Indian Shastras, like Alankara Shastra, Rupaka Shastra, Natya Shastra, Sangita Shastra, about the analysis of stories. Itivritta, as per Bharata, is the body of any of these art forms. Itivrittantu natyasya shariram parikirtyate is what he says. And because of the significance that is given to itivritta, the plot, the story of any narrative literary form or narrative performing art form, itivritta has been given a great attention in analysis in Shastra. There is this basic of classification of itivritta into three types: prakhyata, utpadya, and mishra. Prakhyata is the already known story. Utpadya is the created story, concocted story, fictitious story. And mishra is a combination of prakhyata and utpadana, the poet's own creation. In fact, Plato, in his Utopian Republic, he wants to boycott poets because he says poets bluff about gods. Actually, what Plato is talking about there is this Mishratva. The mythological story, the Greco-Roman mythological stories that Plato is attending to there, they're all stories of gods. This bluffing that Plato is talking about is this Mishrana. And in the Indic tradition, there was no resistance to this Mishrana because the original intention, the spirit of the original storyteller or the story creator is not disturbed by the poets like Kalidasa. In Abhijnana Shakuntala, the original story is taken from Mahabharata, Shakuntalopakyana, Dushyanta Charitra, whatever you call, Dushyanta Parva. That story uh, is presented in a totally different way in Abhijnana Shakuntalam. But the original spirit of the story from Mahabharata is not disturbed by Kalidasa. So that is Mishra. The way it is presented in Abhijnana Shakuntala is Mishra. That liberty for Mishra is given. Shiva Kumarji was running a long Twitter thread about creative liberty for storytellers. This creative liberty was questioned by some people on Twitter when they said that the original story, like Plato was also doing the same. Plato was saying, oh, you should not bluff about gods. But if you go by that logic, all the folk forms of Ramayana, folk versions of Ramayana, folk versions of Mahabharata, folk versions of Mahabharata, or folk versions of any other Purana for that matter would not have come into existence at all. Folk storytellers took that liberty and created their own stories out of the characters of Ramayana. They created no characters also. In a version of Ramayana, there is Mairavana. You have a son for Hanuman who is working for this Mahiravana, who is underground. And you have Yuddha between Rama and Anjaneya. You have a Yuddha between Krishna and Arjuna. All these are folk versions of stories from Mahabharata, Ramayana, and all that. That creative liberty was taken, and Mishras were created. Mishra versions of tales were created. This is the generation of Utpadya, fictitious stories, fiction, novels, short stories. So your talent in uh, novel writing or short story writing is in terms of creating a new story, not telling an existing story. Very rarely you have among novels, historical novels or mythological novels. Most of the novels are contemporary family sociology oriented novels. So these novels are created stories. For that matter, if you have studied literature, novels, literature, you would know that even a historical novel or a mythological novel is basically fictitious. There is a famous statement about historical novels that everything is false in a historical novel except the dates and names. This is a statement by an analyst called May, a literature scholar. But this is the generation where it is enjoyed. And people who got used to fictitious story enjoyment, fictitious story entertainment through novels and short stories, started wondering why the same story is told again and again by people. Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavata, why? Even bedtime tales, same tale. My mother, who is the grandmother of my children, used to narrate the same story of the lion and the hare to my children hundreds of times. They were never bored. They used to go back again and again to her. Even if she goes to some other story, they used to say, no, no, lion and the hare. And it used to get repeated. Why Prakhyata, known story, has such a great significance in entertaining people and why people are pulled again and again towards the same story. There are wonderful theories about it. One of the contemporary writers who narrated Ramayana again and got Jnanapith Award in 1968 in Telugu, he says the secret is in the rasa. The rasa that the storyteller is creating is the secret. So the entertaining portion there is the rasa creation, the emotion creation through telling. It is not the story that is attracting. If it is just the story, people would have said it is boring. I don't want to hear the same story again and again. Unlike in the case of fiction, where the story is the entertaining part. And yes, of course, there is a telling part also. You have to tell that story also beautifully. But the novel reader is enjoying the story creation also, fiction. But in the case of Prakhyata, the telling part is being emphasized. The same known story is entertaining the audience. Globally, this Prakhyata was, is, and is going to be the chief of the Itivritta varieties. However much Utpadya might come, fiction might come, Prakhyata is going to remain the chief forms of narratives. Because people like to get entertained through that kind of telling. And the classification of narratives already existed in the Veda, in Rig Veda and Yajur Veda. Already they have words for classifying narratives. By the time of Brahmanas and Aranyakas, it developed much further. And Agni Purana has got a systematic classification of narratives. And it went on and on. How much of analysis of stories went into this. There is a theory called hypothetical nature of narratives. This is from Northrop Frye. Uh, in his Anatomy of Criticism, he brings this theory of hypothetical nature of narratives. It almost equates literature with science, like chemistry. If in chemistry you have equations like A plus B gives rise to C plus D, in stories, a character of this type plus another character of this type, their interaction leads to this type of interaction. There is a formula. This he calls hypothetical nature of story. Parallel to this, in my PhD dissertation, I proposed theory Anumitivada from Indic perspective, in which I argue that while storytelling, storytellers use simple present tense. For example, to say that the king went to the queen, the king goes to the queen is used. And this simple present is a tense which is used for generalizing anything that happens all the time, right? What I propose is that stories reverse this. Stories reverse the simple present into narrative past, into past tense. So what stories are doing is that, like chemistry gives you always, uh, there is an interaction between these two, sodium carbonate plus water gives rise to sodium hydroxide kind of equation. It always happens. The same thing is there in story in the form of simple present tense, but the story creator is converting that into past tense. It happened, he says. So stories are generalizing from people's lives. Stories are giving the typical of the characters. That is why the storytellers or story creators are great observers of human nature. That is why the stories in a psychology course that I created for Pune University, an undergrad course we are running there in MIT School of Vedic Sciences. We have a sixth semester course on how narratives or stories are psychology books. All stories are psychology books, basically, because they are storytellers or story creators, psychological observations. They theorize the human nature. Bhamaha says stories are read or heard vyavahara vide, to know about the world, to know the ways of the world. Why people come to stories is because they want to learn. They want to learn about the world. Vyavahara vide. In Richakatikam, Shudraka says, you by going through this play, you learn kalacharita, how villains behave. And people come for that knowledge also. So stories are both knowledge giving and entertaining. Shive tarakshataye sadyah paranirvritaye, all this. And there is a kanta sammitataya upadesha yuje also. Like a wife delicately instructs the husband, stories also delicately instruct, they give a message. So all these functions of stories are the ones which are pulling people again and again for stories. And um, this is a great treasure. And I'm so delighted to know that storytelling has become such a wonderful, lucrative profession into which many have entered. And so many of them are Indic oriented. Unless they are Indic oriented or Indigenous oriented, they would not have come for this conference. Our conference has got that restriction. So that is very satisfying to know. I am very glad if a university teacher like me is given an opportunity to talk about things, they can go on and on for all the 2 days analyzing things. I was just trying to point as Dik Pradarshana, they say, Dik Darshana, that there is so much of analysis about stories in ancient India that we can take help of. Uh, and I'm very glad that Shivakumarji has put in this conference together so well. And I wish all the paper presenters all the best. Uh, and thank you for responding to us in such an overwhelming way. And thanks to all the audience who are participating in such a big number. I know that that is going to be a wonderful knowledge giving and entertaining experience for all the big number of audience that have come for this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagaraj. It's always, the kind of pleasure listening to Dr. Nagaraj is something else. I of course have the opportunity a lot more in my in various projects that we do together, and especially this part of the narratives, the Itivrata. Very few people will know the way Nagaraj Garu knows, and repeatedly listening to him, I have really understood the depth of the complex conceptual clarity with which Bharatiya Parampara has shaped these things.